You're listening to Real Conversations, where every week we take a peek at the favorite movies of fascinating people. Real Conversations is hosted by Brian Coley, the founder of Art Within and Real. This week, Brian is honored to be joined by producers Howard Kazanjian and Darren Moorman. Howard is best known for producing Raiders of the Lost Ark and Return of the Jedi. Kazanjian is also a former 8-year vice president of Lucasfilms Limited. Darren was mentored by Howard and has produced several projects of his own, including the upcoming feature film, Same Kind of Different as Me. Brian sits down with Howard and Darren at Howard's home in Los Angeles.
So I'm so honored really to have Howard Kazanjian on the podcast today, as well as my friend Darren. Howard, as the intro that we just said, is just a huge influence in Hollywood and has been a part of some major films. And so to be able to talk to him today about his top tens and the films that move him is just a really wonderful privilege. And then talking to him about Darren has been mentored by him, and just seeing how their movies maybe reflect a little bit of that, or looking at each other through their movies is something I'm looking forward to today. So Howard, thank you for being here and being a part of this. So tell the audience the movies that are on your top 10. So just go ahead and list them out, and so that they know what is on your top 10.
The Ten Commandments, My Fair Lady, Citizen Kane, Casablanca, The Godfather, Fiddler on the Roof, The Magnificent Seven, The Great Escape, Some Like It Hot, Friendly Persuasion.
Nice, very good.
And obviously there are more, but
yeah,
we're limited to 10.
I limited you. If you want to creep some other ones in there, I know there were some that you actually were a part of that are on my list, like Raiders of the Lost Ark. So tell me, as you look at this picture of the posters of your top 10, what do you see? You know, what's the first thing that kind of strikes you as far as looking at them?
Well, the first favorite film of all time when I was very young was The Ten Commandments.
Yeah.
And it remained my only number one film for many, many, actually decades.
Really? Okay.
And it wasn't only until recent that I start saying I have a few other favorite films. You've limited me to 10, and that's why we're talking about 10.
Yeah. So tell me what the influence that Ten Commandments had on your life. You know, like what scenes moved you? Like what about the film really moved you? Obviously, it's about the Bible, and of course that being an influence in your life. But was there anything specifically about the movie that kind of
Well, it was a very vivid story, exciting story about Moses.
Yeah.
It was directed by Cecil B. DeMille, who was a great director at the time and had done several biblical movies. But it was very visual. Mm-hmm. It was widescreen. It had visual effects. Mm-hmm. I mean, how often do you see the parting of the Red Sea?
Yeah.
How often do you see Egypt built and the temples and Moses and the chariots?
Yeah. Was it an influence on you as an artist or you as a producer to say, I want to make big films? Because a lot of your films on your top 10, they're widescreen. They're CinemaScope. They're huge films. They're epic in their nature, and they're classic as far as American history, as far as film history. So was there something in you that saw the Ten Commandments and said, I want to make something big?
Yeah, I was a teenager at the time, and it was one of the turning points where I said, I want to be in the movie business.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah. And how did it kind of shape making a movie like Raiders of the Lost Ark or Return of the Jedi or something like that? Was there a sense in which that same imagery of what you described with Moses and the bigness of what DeMille did that kind of was...
Well, with Raiders and other films that interest me or screenplays that interest me, it's the action, adventure, and historical part of it. With Raiders, I had seen as a young kid on television, and very few in the theater because I wasn't quite that old, serials. Mm-hmm. And I had a large selection of VHS and 8mm serials.
Okay.
And that, I mean, I'm not going to take all the credit. Certainly George Lucas has to take most of the credit. But that's how we came up with Raiders of the Lost Ark. We knew that serials lasted anywhere from 12 to 15 minutes. And we knew that we had to have a cliffhanger every 12 or 15 minutes.
Yeah.
And that's how we designed it. After looking at many serials on the screen and saying, look at that particular scene.
Yeah.
Write that down. Let's think of that one. And as George Lucas has said many times, nothing is original. Just look around and collect it and put it together. And that's what we did with Raiders.
Yeah.
Raiders would have been on my top 10.
Yeah.
But you all asked me not to put my personal films.
Yeah. And so when you look at your top 10 right now, or some of your top 10, or some of your favorite movies, I would say, which one maybe stands out as almost an outlier?
Some Like It Hot is a black and white, very funny film directed by one of the top directors of all times, Billy Wilder. I also had the opportunity to work with Billy Wilder.
Really?
So perhaps that is one of the reasons why I chose that film. I knew his sensitivity. I knew his writing abilities, his timing abilities, and him as a director. I was able to see that.
Wow.
And I could translate that to Some Like It Hot. But Jack Lemmon and Marilyn Monroe and Tony Curtis,
Yeah.
I mean, how much better can you get?
It's just classic.
How much funnier can a film be?
Yeah. Yeah.
How much on the left side of logic can it be?
Right. Yeah. So one of the things I noticed on your top 10 was I'm thinking about My Fair Lady and then looking at Rick in Casablanca, looking at in The Godfather, as well as Fiddler on the Roof. You've got a lot of really strong men, or really big present men. You know, Rick is a big presence, and obviously The Godfather. In My Fair Lady, you've got a very proud guy who rubbing against this woman ends up changing him and opening him up. You've got Fiddler on the Roof with this big papa figure. How does that sound to you? Is that something that you experienced maybe in your life, where a woman kind of changed you and sort of who you were, or is there any reference to kind of your dad, or how does it look to see all these kind of big, kind of masculine figures that are both influencers as well as being influenced?
Well, I never thought of it that way. You just now opened my eyes to perhaps what is a subconscious movement on my part. With My Fair Lady, let's talk about that for a minute. I saw My Fair Lady with my dad at the Radio City Music Hall, which was the first time I was there. And then the movie opened up on that gigantic screen.
Yeah.
And I saw it again 2 weeks ago. And it's superbly made for its time. And the quality of production. Now, remember, I come from the production side. I mean, I couldn't find anything wrong with that movie, whether it be the presentation or the art direction. And again, it won a half dozen awards.
Yeah.
But I always said at that time, and I wasn't a filmmaker, but as a filmmaker, that's the type of production, that's the type of quality I want to put into my films.
Wow.
That's why it's on this list.
That's awesome. So do you see anything as far as, when we were talking about, you said you went with your dad, and was there a sense in which, what's your story? Like, where do you come from? Where, who is your dad? Like, what did he do? And how did you kind of get into the industry itself?
Oh, that's a lot of questions there. Let's start with my dad. My dad came from Europe, was left alone in Europe when he was 5, and learned his trade from his uncle. And at 13 had worked as an apprentice and had gone to school at night to get a degree. and came first class to America when he was 13 and set up his own. He was taught to be a gem cutter of rubies, emeralds, sapphires, etc. And he set up his own store at the age of 13 on the East Coast. It failed. He moved to New York, where he was successful, and it eventually came out to California. And he was known as the most important precious gem cutter in the world.
Wow.
And would travel the world each year looking for gems, usually rough stones, because he understood rough material.
Yeah.
Most people don't.
Yeah.
Or at that time, he would travel to Europe, where the Maharajas would have tremendous emeralds, and he had the skill to take a precious stone that, let's say, was 10 carats, and recut it to 9.5 carats, but triple the value.
Wow.
That was his skill. And my parents, at the age of 11, gave me an 8mm camera, not Super 8, hand crank 8mm camera. And I would start taking home movies and making movies as best as I could with a hand crank 50-foot, not magazine, but spool.
Yeah.
No sound. Eventually graduated into sound and Super 8. But we didn't even have stop motion on that, frame by frame. And so I remember shooting an apple being eaten, bite by bite by bite, or the clouds rolling by, certain things like that.
Yeah.
And then eventually went to USC Film School. And the summer that I was graduating, I took a test that happened to be given at USC by the Directors Guild / Producers Guild of America, where they were looking for, it was assistant directors. And I was fortunate. Then I took this test. I scored high enough for an interview. And out of 2,000 who took the test, 10 of us were selected to be in the first assistant directors training program. And you're trained for 200 days on various shows, and then set out in the world. And then I became an first assistant director, and some people called me the legend of assistant directors, and got to a certain time in my life where I said, that's it. I'm not going to be an assistant director anymore. And that's when George Lucas came along and asked me if I would work with him on THX 1138.
Tell me about that, because that project was most people don't know that project, and yet that was sort of his big project going out of Zoetrope, and I know that it was pretty much a huge mammoth film that prepared the way probably for Star Wars, I would say. Would you say?
Now for his senior film at USC, he did the shorter version of THX 1138.
Yeah.
Francis Coppola got him at Warner Brothers to do the extended version, or the full-length theatrical version, of which he did.
So tell me a little bit about your ride in that period of time, like being alongside of these incredible things being created as far as, what would be film history.
The ride?
Yeah, the ride itself, I just can't imagine being a part of something like Raiders or being a part of what Lucas was creating during the time. And it just seems like at that time, based on Coppola making The Godfather, that was sort of the ticket for everyone, was kind of him doing that. And then Lucas making that film, it was a big risk and liability, but then it seemed to pay off later on. But from your standpoint, what did it look like? Like during that time, what did all this look like and feel like as a person who was along the journey with these great?
Well, let me go back a little bit. I was an assistant director on Finian's Rainbow with Francis Coppola.